The cold chain contract. The temperature trap. The smell of my processing plant, the scent of stainless steel, salt brine, and raw, clean meat, is the smell of my inheritance. It's a clean, cold, hard-working scent, and it's the heart of everything I am. My name is Alex Thorne, no relation to the vulture in the half-inch rule debacle, thank God, and I run Prairie Crest Meats. We're small, we're specialized, and we're one of the last independent slaughterhouses and processors in the state that handles truly heritage livestock. The stuff MegaMeat Incorporated can't clone in a lab. Our reputation is built on quality that goes far beyond USDA standards. It's built on a century of family pride. We supply the high-end butchers, the farm-to-table restaurants, and the customers who know the difference between industrial filler and genuine craft. This plant isn't just a business, it's the mortgage on my home, the college fund for my 2 kids, and the economic backbone of 20 local farms. The stakes were always high, but they felt manageable, until Agent Vance walked through the blast chiller door. It was a Tuesday, typically the busiest day for initial inspections before the major weekend processing run. The usual inspector, a decent woman named Martha who understood the difference between a minor paperwork error and a genuine hazard, had called in sick. In her place arrived Agent Silas Vance. He didn't introduce himself so much as he materialized, dressed in a charcoal suit that was entirely too sharp for a slaughterhouse floor. He wore thin leather gloves and carried a briefcase that looked like it contained less paperwork and more classified ordnance. Martha had smelled faintly of coffee and patience. Vance smelled like cologne and clinical judgment. He didn't look at the meat or the cleanliness. He looked at the instruments. "Mr. Thorne," he stated, his voice flat, emotionless, and echoing in the high ceilings of the cutting room. "I am Agent Vance, sis. I am performing a full, unscheduled systems audit focused on adherence to post-processing chilling protocols." I knew instantly this wasn't routine. Vance wasn't interested in the easy checklist items. He didn't check the sanitation logs, the employee hygiene protocols, or the general cleanliness, all areas where we were meticulous. He went straight past the cutting floor, past the brining tanks, and directly into the cold storage vault where the processed carcasses were hanging for rapid temperature drop. He didn't even use the primary USDA checklist. He had his own, printed on thick, security-grade paper. "I am specifically interested in your adherence to the 1998 Refrigeration Stabilization Protocol, Appendix D2, he announced, pulling a highly specialized, handheld thermometer that looked like it belonged on the International Space Station, not a farm in rural America. He bypassed our official, calibrated logging probes and inserted his own into the deep muscle tissue of a freshly processed half-hog, a beautiful specimen of old spot heritage pork. The 1998 protocol, I knew, was the stuff of nightmares for old-school processors. It was created in the wake of a major, national contamination scare, and it mandated an incredibly specific, non-linear cooling curve for processed meat to inhibit the growth of specific pathogens. It was designed primarily for the massive, high-throughput plants of MegaMeat Incorporated, where carcasses moved by the thousands, making generic cooling assumptions necessary. For a small plant like mine, where we handled single animals with high-end, efficient chillers, it was overkill, but we followed the letter of the law. Or so I thought. Vance watched his display for exactly 1 hour, timing the inspection with the chilling process. The room was silent except for the low, powerful hum of the refrigeration units. My plant manager, Frank, stood next to me, sweating despite the 35 degrees Fahrenheit air, knowing the gravity of this man's attention. The core issue wasn't the final temperature, it was the rate of temperature drop, RTD. The law required the core temperature to drop by at least 1 degree Fahrenheit every 1.5 minutes for the first 60 minutes, ensuring the product passed swiftly through the danger zone where bacteria multiply fastest. At the 60-minute mark, Vance pulled the probe out with a snap. He stared at the resulting graph on his device, a flicker of something that looked like professional satisfaction crossing his otherwise blank face. "Violation detected," he stated, his voice now carrying the cold weight of absolute authority. My stomach dropped. "A violation? What are you talking about? We just verified the internal temperature is well within the acceptable range. The final temperature is adequate, Mr. Thorne. But your rate of temperature drop failed to meet the mandated trajectory precisely at minute 48 of the cycle. He tapped the device, showing a microscopic dip on the cooling curve. At minute 48, the temperature dropped by only 0.6 degrees over the 1-minute interval, not the mandated 0.667 degrees, 1 degree per 1.5 minutes. That microstutter places you in non-compliance with the 1998 Refrigeration Stabilization Protocol, Appendix D2, subsection 3, which requires adherence to the RTD curve at every point within the initial 60-minute window. He then delivered the blow. As a result of this failure to maintain the established microbial safety barrier, all product currently in the chilling and freezing units is subject to a temporary hold and quarantine order pending a full thermodynamic recertification of your chilling system, which must include the installation of a mandated supplementary cryogenic injection system. I nearly laughed, but the panic in Frank's eyes stopped me. A cryogenic injection system? That was a multi-million-dollar installation only MegaMeat used for their 20,000 head per day facility. It was physically impossible to justify or afford for my scale. Agent Vance, this is absurd, I argued, trying to keep my voice steady. That deviation is statistically insignificant. It's a fraction of a degree. It doesn't impact food safety, and our internal logs show compliance. Your internal logs are irrelevant, Mr. Thorne. Only the official FSIS calibration is binding. He started writing up the citation, the pen scratching like a knife on my future. The violation carries an initial administrative fine of $25,000 and the hold order remains in effect until recertification. Given the nature of this microfailure, the quarantine will apply to your entire cold storage inventory. 7 tons of processed, specialty meat. 7 tons. That was 2 weeks of high-margin product already earmarked for delivery, worth over $300,000, which would now rot while I fought the paperwork. The delay alone would cost me my biggest contracts. That's when the corporate link clicked. Vance paused and looked at me, not with judgment, but with an almost pitying sneer. You know, Mr. Thorne, if you worked for a large operation, like MegaMeat, they could absorb this cost and have the supplemental systems installed by Friday. They have the volume to justify it. Small operations like this, well, they struggle with compliance. The subtext was as cold as the meat locker. Surrender. Sell out to MegaMeat. This is a targeted corporate execution, using the USDA badge as the bullet. I watched him seal the notice on the door of my walk-in freezer. A bright, official red tag that screamed "Do not disturb. Contamination risk." It was a death sentence delivered by a technicality. Frank looked at the red tag, then at me. Alex, what do we do? We have the Denver shipment leaving tomorrow. We fight, I said, the words coming out hard and clear despite the tremor in my hands. The fight wasn't about a fraction of a degree. It was about the survival of local agriculture against a corporation weaponizing bureaucracy. Vance had found his rule. Now, I had to find mine. I knew this wasn't an accident. It was a raid. I resolved right then that Silas Vance wouldn't just leave my plant. He would leave the USDA entirely. The rule he chose to use, the 1998 protocol, was his downfall, because it was too new. I needed to find a statute so old it was written in ink only bureaucrats forget. I needed to go back to the beginning, to the very foundation of the USDA's power. Back to the days when they protected the little guy, not the corporate giant. My desk, stacked with decades of USDA and FSIS manuals, was waiting. The deep dive had begun. The cold chain contract, the evisceration of trust. The immediate fallout and financial rot. The silence in the processing plant was deafening. Where there should have been the cheerful clang of steel hooks and the rhythmic grind of the brine pump, there was only the mournful, steady hum of the chillers fighting a losing battle against time and bureaucracy. 7 tons of meat. 7 tons of beautiful, ethically raised, heritage pork and beef, cooling meticulously for nothing. The worst part was the smell, not the clean, metallic scent of fresh processing, but a faint, cloying sweetness that was the first herald of putrefaction. It was the scent of failure, of money rotting, of trust dissolving. The phone calls started immediately. First, from the specialized butchers in Denver and Chicago demanding to know why their high-end shipment was delayed. shipments that were the lifeblood of my operation. Then, the banks. My operating line of credit was tied directly to my accounts receivable, and when $300,000 worth of invoices evaporated overnight, the bank manager, a nervous man named Mr. Peterson, started talking about collateral and default rates. The cruelest call, though, was the one I had to make. I had to pay the 20 local farmers for the livestock, as per our contract, even though their product was now federally seized and worthless. Don't worry, I told them, my voice hollow, the payment is wired. It's my problem now. That $150,000 payout emptied my cash reserves, but I had to protect them. I realized Vance hadn't just targeted me. He was attacking the entire local agricultural ecosystem, hoping to starve out my suppliers until they, too, were forced to sell their herds to MegaMeat's automated feedlots. The sight of the red FSIS quarantine tag felt like a personal insult, a declaration of war. That microstutter in the temperature curve, the one Vance had used to justify this destruction, was statistically nothing. The bacteria they claimed to fear couldn't multiply fast enough in that short interval to pose a risk. The rule wasn't for safety, it was for destruction by technicality. I knew I was playing against a rigged deck, but I wasn't folding. The corporate shadow and the reluctant informant. I drove 80 miles to the regional USDA field office, not to argue with Vance, who had already vanished, but to talk to anyone I could. I found a weary, mid-level supervisor named David, a man whose soul had clearly been processed out of him years ago by mandatory efficiency meetings. He avoided eye contact as he sipped the world's saddest vending machine coffee. I laid out the facts, the insignificant nature of the RTD violation, the immediate issuance of the cryogenic system requirement, and the conveniently timed offer I had received 6 months prior from Cold Chain Logistics, a known shell company for MegaMeat, to buy my facility. David refused to confirm anything, but his silence was confirmation enough. Mr. Thorne, he sighed, polishing his glasses. Agent Vance, he has a reputation. He's called the closer around here. He doesn't write tickets for the sake of compliance. He writes business decisions. His specialty is finding an obsolete clause, applying it with absolute literalness, and documenting it so thoroughly that the appeals process is crippled from day one. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The 1998 protocol? That's MegaMeat's playbook. They helped write the final language in Appendix D2. They're the only ones who can afford the supplemental cryosystems required for recertification. It's a self-serving loop. Vance is just executing the contract. He gets a reputation for efficiency, a fast-track promotion, and your competition gets eliminated. He's not paid by the government. He's paid by the future opportunities provided by the industry he audits. David paused, his eyes darting to the door. Just, don't go fighting the rule, Alex. You won't win. Fight the jurisdiction. Find a rule that tells the 1998 protocol to sit down and shut up. Go back before the 90s. Before the corporate farm bills. Go back to when they cared about stability, not standardization. He slid a faded, brittle photocopy across the desk. It was an index page of the 1957 Federal Meat Inspection Act, FMIA. Start here. Everything else is a derivative. The research trench, digging through history. I returned to my office, the air thick with the metallic tang of old legal paper and desperation. The next 72 hours were a blur of caffeine, frustration, and the musty smell of decades of bureaucratic history. The fight wasn't in the plant anymore. It was in the archive. I had the 1957 FMIA, and I started digging. I quickly discovered the problem. While the 1998 protocol was entirely digital, streamlined, and indexed by keyword, rate of temperature drop, microbial hazard analysis, etc., the older documents were a sprawling, contradictory mess. I spent hours wrestling with microfilm readers and navigating the labyrinth of the Library of Congress's digitized USDA collection, a collection seemingly indexed by a board intern circa 1995. You couldn't search for grandfather clause. You had to know the exact title, date, and sometimes, the original author's name. I was looking for an exemption that applied specifically to equipment, not the product. Vance attacked the performance, the RTD. I needed a law that protected the machine. I needed proof that the chilling unit I inherited from my grandfather, a massive, overbuilt, and meticulously maintained system, was legally superior to the newfangled, fragile units used by MegaMeat. I pulled up my plant's maintenance logs, dating back to 1968, stored in yellowed binders. Our chilling system, the Briggs 500, was installed in 1974. It was built like a tank, running on old, powerful compressors that simply wouldn't quit. They were less efficient than modern units, perhaps, but their chilling capacity was immense, designed to overcome the thermal inertia of huge, non-cut carcasses, a technique long abandoned by industrial processing but perfect for heritage whole animals. The frustration was mounting. Every time I thought I found an exemption, a 1985 amendment regarding small plant capacity adjustments, I'd hit a superseded by PL 105 to 320 wall. That public law, 105 to 320, was the very foundation of the 1998 protocol Vance was using. He had calculated every move perfectly. The law was a stack of dominoes, and he had knocked over the critical one. The breakthrough, the continuous service exception. It was 4 a.m., the plant still humming with the sickening waste of quarantined product. I was running on the dregs of the coffee pot and pure, angry adrenaline. I had abandoned the digitized files and was staring at a PDF of the original 1957 Federal Meat Inspection Act document, focusing on the sections regarding physical plant certification. I saw a tiny, almost illegible reference in Section 5, dealing with mandatory inspection of apparatus. I cross-referenced it with the 1962 regulatory guidelines, which detailed the initial certification standards for chilling units. This was it, Section 5, Subclause 14, Equipment Longevity and Continuous Service Exception, ELCSE. The ELCSE was beautiful in its simplicity and its complete obsolescence in the modern era. It read, essentially, any chilling apparatus certified by FSIS and documented as being in continuous service for 25 or more years prior to January 1, 1980, shall be exempt from any subsequent mandatory recertification requirements pertaining to rate of temperature drop, RTD, monitoring, provided the apparatus meets its original certified thermal inertia target, TIT, standards and maintains all required maintenance logs. My plant system was certified in 1974. Continuous service since then? Check. 25 years before 1980? No, but 25 years before now didn't matter. The law was about continuous service relative to the 1980 cutoff date. It was a grandfather clause of magnificent proportion, meant to protect post-war infrastructure. It meant my Briggs 500 was legally a dinosaur, and that dinosaur was exempt from the micromonitoring imposed by the 1998 Act. The only thing that mattered was proving my equipment met its original, simpler standard, the thermal inertia target. I dug out the 1974 certification documents. There, in bold script, was the TIT, Total Thermal Energy Removal Capacity, 15,000 BTUs hour. I immediately cross-referenced the current, real-time cooling data captured by Vance's own sensor. Even with the microstutter, the system was still operating at 17,000 BTUs hour. My old system was overperforming its 1974 standard. The ELCSE nullified the 1998 protocol completely. The law Vance used was irrelevant to my equipment. I looked at the moldy stack of maintenance logs next to me. Logs my grandfather kept, then my father, and now me. They were the final pieces of evidence for the continuous service clause. I had the gun. I had the bullet. Now, I just needed to find Agent Vance and shoot. But I wouldn't shoot to kill the case. I would shoot to kill his career. He used a rule to destroy my business. I would use a different rule to destroy his future. The ELCSE was my weapon of choice. Preemptive strike. Before I filed the counterclaim, I made one more move. I called the editor of the Midwestern Farmers Gazette. He owed me a favor. I didn't give him the legal details, just the human headline, USDA shutters heritage butcher over microfraction of a degree, 7 tons of food waste. I wanted the public pressure to start cooking before I dropped the legal hammer. When I saw the headline on the online edition, I knew I was ready for the next move. The cold chain contract, the counterfiling, and the corporate offer. The stench of rotting injustice. It had been 5 days since the quarantine tag went up. The stench in the plant was unbearable now, a mix of brine, coolant, and the acrid smell of decaying meat. The tangible cost of bureaucratic malice. I had to pay a specialized biohazard crew to dispose of the 7 tons of inventory. A financial hit so severe it nearly put me in the red. But the disposal provided a grim motivation. Vance had thought he was destroying a shipment. He was actually manufacturing my personal evidence. I documented the entire disposal process, cross-referencing the weight and value with the date and time of his original, hyper-technical violation. This wasn't just a fine anymore. It was a case of tortious interference with my livelihood, authorized under the fraudulent guise of public safety. The Midwestern Farmers Gazette article had done its job. The phones at the regional FSIS office were ringing off the hook, filled with angry consumers asking why the USDA, whose motto was often about protecting American agriculture, was actively destroying locally sourced food over a microfraction of a degree. This public pressure was the political lubricant I needed for my legal trap. I officially filed my countermotion with the Administrative Law Judge, ALJ, for the USDA's Office of Adjudication late Friday afternoon. My filing didn't just contest the $25,000 fine. It demanded the immediate lifting of the hold order and sought damages related to the destruction of the 7 tons of product, citing the 1939 Federal Tort Claims Act for negligent enforcement. But the true weapon was the Equipment Longevity and Continuous Service Exception, ELCSE. I included photocopies of the 1974 certification for the Briggs 500 chilling unit and the maintenance logs proving its continuous, overperforming service, which, under the ELCSE, made the 1998 protocol completely non-applicable to my specific apparatus. The countermotion was a stack of paper an inch thick, meticulously cross-referenced. The final page was a personal motion to initiate a formal internal affairs review of Agent Silas Vance for professional misconduct and unauthorized application of regulatory statute, specifically questioning his relationship with third-party entities requiring cryogenic system installation. Vance's cold reaction. Agent Vance didn't return my calls. He didn't respond to the ALJ's official notification of the counterclaim. Instead, he showed up at the plant Monday morning, not in his sharp suit, but in a field uniform, accompanied by 2 silent, burly USDA security contractors. He was there to solidify the siege, attempting to intimidate me into withdrawing the internal affairs review. "Mr. Thorne," he said, holding a clipboard that contained only one document, a blank form. He didn't look at the sealed freezer door, now utterly irrelevant as the product was gone. "The administrative fine of $25,000 is due immediately. Failure to remit payment will result in the permanent revocation of your FSIS grant of inspection, effective within 48 hours. He was attempting to bypass the legal process. He was banking on the paperwork and the financial pressure to break me before the ALJ could even schedule a preliminary hearing. "Agent Vance, I believe you received the countermotion on Friday," I said, leaning against the cold steel of a processing table. "It cites the 1962 Regulatory Guidelines, Section 5, Subclause 14, ELCSE. It states that my Briggs 500 unit is exempt from the RTD monitoring imposed by the 1998 protocol, provided it meets its 1974 thermal inertia target. Which it does." Vance didn't even flinch. He just gave a small, condescending smile. "Ah, the relics. You are operating under a superseded statute, Mr. Thorne. Public Law 105-320 explicitly states, and I quote, 'All prior exemptions and waivers related to continuous service for chilling apparatus are hereby repealed and replaced by the uniform standards outlined in the 1998 protocol.' You wasted your time. The ELCSE is a historical curiosity, not a valid legal defense." He was lying. Or, more accurately, he was relying on a partial truth. The 105-320 public law did repeal most prior exemptions. But I had read the original 105-320 congressional record, all 400 pages of the debate. I knew the single, tiny exception to the repeal. I pulled out my own worn copy of the 1962 guidelines, tabbed and highlighted. "You are correct, Agent Vance, that PL 105 to 320 repealed most exemptions. But there is a famous carve-out, the Congressional Grandfather Amendment of 1997, inserted into the 105 to 320 debate specifically to protect 10 specific, historical meat processing plants. It reads, "The repeal of continuous service exemptions shall not apply to any facility which can demonstrate continuous operation under the ELCSE, and which supplies fewer than 25 independent butchers or grocers within a 20-state region, and is certified as a heritage livestock processor by the National Heritage Livestock Registry." I put my finger on the third clause. My plant, Prairie Crest Meats, is one of those 10. We were certified in 1982. This entire facility is legally, specifically grandfathered out of your 1998 protocol. You have levied a fraudulent fine using a non-applicable law, and you forced the destruction of over $300,000 of product. I looked him straight in his cold, calculating eyes. You didn't just write a bad ticket, Agent Vance. You committed federal fraud, and I have filed for an internal affairs review and personal liability. The MegaMeat interruption. Vance's composure cracked. His lips tightened into a thin, white line. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had missed the single, targeted loophole put there by an old-school senator 20 years ago to protect people exactly like me. Before he could speak, a car, another black, expensive sedan, but this one with tinted windows and 0 federal plates, pulled up. Out stepped a man in a bespoke suit, looking utterly out of place on my gravel driveway. He introduced himself, extending a manicured hand with a ring that screamed wealth, as Mr. Julian Reed, Vice President of Acquisitions for Cold Chain Logistics, MegaMeat's shadow company. Reed ignored Vance, walking straight up to me with a practiced, predatory sincerity. "Mr. Thorne, I saw the article. Tragic. Truly tragic what these bureaucrats do to the honest American farmer. But we have a solution." He pulled out a checkbook, not a briefcase, and leaned in. "We know you're facing liquidity issues after the loss of your inventory and the legal fees. Cold Chain Logistics is prepared to offer you $5 million for this facility. Today, cash. We'll cover your $25,000 fine and Vance's legal costs, and you walk away solvent. You get to keep your land, we just take the processing plant and the contracts." $5 million. It was an astronomical offer, far exceeding the plant's market value. It was the price of panic. They knew I had found the flaw in their regulatory weapon, and they were trying to buy my silence and their control back before the ALJ hearing exposed the conspiracy. Vance watched, frozen, knowing his future depended on me taking that check. The refusal and the legal threat. I looked at the checkbook, then at Vance, who was pleading with his eyes. Then I looked at the dark, wet stain on the concrete where 7 tons of heritage meat had been rendered into waste. I thought about the farmers I paid out of my own pocket, the history of the Briggs 500 shilling unit, and the smell of rot that Vance had inflicted upon my life. I slowly pushed the checkbook away. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. But my plant is not for sale. Not at any price." Reed's polite mask slipped, revealing a flicker of genuine rage. "This is your last chance, Thorne. When the ALJ sees the political nightmare you've created, they will drag this out for years. You will be bankrupt by Christmas. Take the money." I addressed Vance, cutting Reed out entirely. "Agent Vance, you leveraged the 1998 protocol to destroy my property. The law you used is inapplicable due to the Congressional Grandfather Amendment of 1997. Not only am I seeking full damages for my lost inventory, but I am now moving to have the ALJ levy a penalty against you personally, under the 1971 Federal Accountability Amendment, for knowingly applying an obsolete regulation to initiate an illegal seizure, similar to the case of Briggs versus Thorne in the half-inch rule precedent. I hadn't just found a loophole. I had tied his fate to a historical precedent of bureaucratic comeuppance. He recognized the reference to the half-inch rule case. It was notorious in FSIS legal circles as the case that ruined a promising career. His face was pure defeat. The pivot and the demand. Julian Reed, sensing Vance was about to collapse, stepped in, his voice low and threatening. "You're going to regret this, Thorne. We will bury you in litigation." We'll find a violation that isn't grandfathered. I'm sure you will, I replied calmly. But you won't do it here. Agent Vance, since I have filed for an internal affairs review based on the Congressional Grandfather Amendment, your jurisdiction over my plant is formally suspended until the ALJ hearing. I am hereby ordering you and your security team off my property, or I will file for an immediate restraining order and cite federal trespass. I handed Vance the final document, a copy of my filing. He took it mechanically, his hands trembling slightly. He knew the internal affairs review meant his files were being looked at, and his cozy relationship with cold chain logistics was about to be exposed. He had lost the battlefield, the legal high ground, and now, his ability to enforce anything. Without a word, he turned, signaled his security detail, and drove away, followed by the silent black sedan carrying the vice president of acquisitions. The plant was quiet again. The quarantine tag was still on the door, but the power had shifted. The fight was far from over, but I had moved it from my blast chiller to the courtroom, and I had a 65-year-old law in my back pocket. Now I had to prove damages, and that meant facing the source of Vance's power, the 1998 protocol itself. The cold chain contract, the public trial and the paper blizzard. The escalation, MegaMeat's full press. Julian Reed, the acquisition VP from Cold Chain Logistics, was not a man accustomed to having his money refused. His polite mask had dropped, replaced by the chilling gaze of a corporate predator whose prey had dared to bite back. His threat, "We will bury you in litigation," was not an empty one. Within 48 hours of my rejection, the paper blizzard began. First, a new USDA inspection team, led by a stern, unsmiling veteran named Agent Henderson, arrived at Prairie Crest Meats. This wasn't Vance's subtle weaponization of a microstutter. This was a full-spectrum regulatory assault. They demanded complete, real-time access to every log, every temperature probe, every employee record for the past 5 years. They even brought in a team to conduct an environmental impact assessment of my waste disposal, implying future fines for effluent runoff, a problem I didn't have. Henderson was polite but relentless, her team a swarm of locusts in lab coats, looking for any conceivable violation, however minor. Simultaneously, my bank received a letter from Cold Chain Logistics' legal department, alleging potential fraud and misrepresentation regarding my collateral, specifically questioning the value of my plant given the recent USDA hold order. This was designed to trigger a review of my operating line of credit, threatening to freeze my accounts and starve me of capital. They wanted to make sure I couldn't afford the legal fight I had just started. Then came the local newspaper hit piece. Not the Midwestern Farmers Gazette, which still backed me, but the larger, regional paper that MegaMeat had significant advertising leverage with. The headline screamed, "Small butcher plant under scrutiny. Food safety concerns raised after massive product seizure." The article quoted unnamed industry experts raising vague fears about legacy infrastructure and outdated processes at small, independent facilities, subtly undermining public trust in Prairie Crest Meats. It was a smear campaign designed to cut off my supply of both customers and future livestock. My plant manager, Frank, looked like he'd aged 5 years in as many days. "Alex, this is too much. They're going to bury us. We can't fight a federal agency and a multi-billion-dollar corporation at the same time." "They want us to give up, Frank," I replied, sifting through the latest batch of subpoenas. "But they don't know what it takes to run a small plant. We're built on doing more with less. And we're about to turn their paper blizzard into a public firestorm." The media counterstrike and the alliance. I leaned into the media storm. Instead of fighting the negative coverage directly, I fed the Midwestern Farmers Gazette a new, more potent story, the offer from Cold Chain Logistics. The new headline, "MegaMeat subsidiary offers $5 million for troubled local butcher amidst USDA crackdown." Critics call it a hostile takeover by regulation. This galvanized the local farming community. The farmers I had paid out of my emptied cash reserves now started calling, offering support. They understood. They knew MegaMeat's tactics because they had all faced them before. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was their fight for survival against corporate agriculture. We had a public hearing scheduled with the administrative law judge, ALJ, in 3 weeks, enough time to turn public opinion into a weapon. My key allies, beyond Frank, were my legal counsel and Dr. Evelyn Chen, a food science expert from the State University who specialized in microbial kinetics in traditional food processing. She agreed to review my case pro bono, outraged by the apparent abuse of the 1998 protocol. Alex, Dr. Chen explained, reviewing Vance's chilling curve data, that 1998 protocol, Appendix D2, is based on a linear pathogen growth model from the early 90s. It was designed for bulk product where surface contamination is the primary risk. But for individual, whole carcasses like yours, where the risk is deep muscle tissue contamination from processing, the primary factor isn't RTD. It's the total time below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, TTB 40, and the maximum attainable core temperature, MACT. She tapped her pen on her notes. Your Briggs 500, with its massive thermal inertia, might have a microstutter at minute 48, but its overall TTB 40 and MACT rates are superior to many modern systems for preventing deep contamination in whole carcasses. Vance knew this. He exploited a protocol that was irrelevant to your actual food safety practices, choosing a metric where even a fraction of a degree would give him a technicality. The ELCSE is brilliant because it bypasses the 1998 protocol's metrics entirely for your equipment. But to win damages, you need to prove the 1998 protocol, as applied, was fundamentally flawed for your operation, and that Vance knew it. Preparing the legal bomb, the Pathogen Paradox. My legal counsel, Sarah Rodriguez, an eagle-eyed attorney who specialized in administrative law, was building our case for damages. Alex, proving the ELCSE exempts you from the 1998 protocol is a win on the fine and the hold order. But to get significant damages, we need to prove willful misconduct. We need to show Vance knew the 1998 protocol was misapplied to your plant, or that he was acting in bad faith for cold chain logistics. Dr. Chen's analysis gives us the angle, I said, a plan forming. The 1998 protocol's RTD metric, as applied to my heritage processing, is not about preventing pathogens in deep muscle tissue. It's about ensuring throughput and preventing surface growth in high-volume plants. My system, under its 1974 TIT standard, inherently handles the deeper risks better. Vance chose a metric he knew didn't apply to the actual risk in my specific processing style. Sarah's eyes lit up. So, he didn't just apply an irrelevant law, he applied an irrelevant safety standard to a plant that was demonstrably safer under its own, older, more appropriate standards. That's not just a technicality, that's a pathogen paradox, a false safety claim used to create a regulatory weapon. This makes the $5 million offer even more damning. It's an admission that their regulatory action was an acquisition strategy. We prepared for the ALJ hearing. The hearing wouldn't be like a courtroom drama. It would be a bureaucratic battle fought with binders of evidence, expert testimony, and precise legal argumentation. I needed to present the ELCSE, Dr. Chen's scientific analysis, and the documented pattern of MegaMeat's harassment to paint a clear picture of corporate weaponization. The public display and the test. While Sarah prepped the legal arguments, I focused on the public perception. I invited the Midwestern Farmers Gazette back to the plant. This time, I had a new chilling unit set up, a small, modern, USDA-certified unit designed for small-batch artisanal processors. It was expensive, but I had a plan. This is my new chilling unit, I explained to the reporter, standing next to the sleek, smaller machine. It meets the 1998 protocol's RTD perfectly, but it's only designed for a single carcass, and it cost me $250,000. My original Briggs 500, which has been performing flawlessly for 50 years, can handle 10 times that volume and actually provides superior food safety for heritage cuts, but it's been declared unsafe by Agent Vance over a statistical microstutter. Then, for the camera, I performed a live demonstration. I processed a small carcass and ran the new unit, showing its perfectly compliant RTD curve on a screen. Then, I showed them the detailed logs from my old Briggs 500, comparing the data. The 1998 protocol wasn't designed to make meat safer, I concluded. It was designed to make it standardized for massive plants. It's killing small businesses like mine, not protecting consumers. This created a powerful visual contrast: the expensive, limited new tech versus the efficient, proven legacy tech. The headline practically wrote itself: "The Microstutter and the $1 Million Chill. Is USDA killing small farmers for corporate gain?" The public outcry intensified. Farmers from surrounding states were now calling in, sharing their own stories of regulatory overreach. I knew Vance would be at the ALJ hearing. So would Julian Reed. They wouldn't be able to ignore the growing political pressure. My goal wasn't just to win. It was to completely dismantle Vance's credibility and the underlying corporate agenda. The ELCSE was the bomb, but the Pathogen Paradox and the public outrage were the shrapnel that would shred his career. The hearing was my chance to flip the script, to turn the weaponized bureaucracy back on its wielder. The cold chain contract. The ELCSE execution and the verdict. The administrative battlefield. The hearing before the Administrative Law Judge, ALJ, Judge Evelyn Davies, was held not in a grand courtroom, but in a small, windowless, beige conference room in the regional federal building. Despite the sterile environment, the atmosphere was charged. Agent Vance was present, looking sickly and nervous, accompanied by his high-powered USDA regulatory counsel, Ms. Lena Shaw, a woman with the severe haircut and reputation of a bureaucratic executioner. Julian Reed, the acquisition VP, sat silently in the back row, a quiet corporate shark observing his investment. The local media, thanks to my persistence, filled the remaining seats. The ALJ, Judge Davies, was all business. She opened the proceedings. This hearing addresses the petitioner, Prairie Crest Meats, challenging the FSIS issuance of a hold and quarantine order and the associated $25,000 fine, and the petitioner's subsequent claim of unlawful regulatory enforcement. The USDA counsel, Ms. Shaw, spoke first. Her argument was simple and arrogant. The facts are undisputed. Agent Vance's calibrated equipment detected a clear, measurable violation of the 1998 Refrigeration Stabilization Protocol, Appendix D2. The law is explicit. Compliance must be maintained at all times. A microstutter is a failure of control, and a failure of control is a public health risk. The petitioner's equipment is obsolete, and Public Law 105-320 explicitly superseded all prior continuous service exemptions. She dismissed my case as a frivolous attempt to circumvent essential modern food safety standards. When it was my attorney, Sarah Rodriguez's turn, she didn't argue the facts of the microstutter, she accepted them. We concur with the USDA's findings that the cooling curve showed a momentary, statistically insignificant drop in the rate of temperature drop, RTD, at minute 48. However, the application of the 1998 protocol to Prairie Crest Meats is ultra vires, beyond the agency's legal authority, due to the Congressional Grandfather Amendment of 1997. Sarah then dropped the bomb: the Equipment Longevity and Continuous Service Exception, ELCSE. She presented the 1974 certification and the continuous maintenance logs, meticulously cross-referenced to the 1997 amendment that shielded 10 specific heritage plants, including mine, from the PL 105-320 repeal. Ms. Shaw immediately objected, calling the ELCSE dormant and irrelevant. Judge Davies stopped her with a sharp look. Counselor, the petitioner has provided clear documentation of continuous service and compliance with the 1974 thermal inertia target, which is the governing standard under the ELCSE. If the ELCSE applies, the 1998 protocol is, indeed, non-applicable. We will address this legal jurisdiction first. The Pathogen Paradox, scientific dismantling. With the legal jurisdiction in doubt, the second stage of my attack began, the scientific argument. We called Dr. Evelyn Chen to the stand. She was calm and authoritative, armed with peer-reviewed data. Dr. Chen, Sarah began, can you explain the primary microbial risk factors in high-volume versus heritage whole carcass processing? Yes, Dr. Chen answered, addressing the ALJ. The 1998 RTD metric is designed to rapidly pass the surface of standardized cuts through the danger zone, a high-throughput solution. But heritage processing, like Mr. Thorne's, deals with non-cut, often whole or half carcasses with high thermal inertia. Here, The real risk is deep muscle contamination, where the core temperature is key. The most critical safety standard is the total time below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, TTB 40, and the maximum attainable core temperature, MACT, which are the original metrics of the 1974 TIT. Dr. Chen then presented a chart comparing the chilling efficacy, the Briggs 500, my old system, versus a standard modern MegaMeat chilling unit, both cooling a heritage-sized half-hog. She showed that despite the RTD microstutter, my old Briggs 500 achieved a TTB 40 that was 12% faster than the 1998 compliance system for the specific type of meat I processed, making it scientifically safer for my operation. Agent Vance, Dr. Chen concluded, chose to enforce a metric that was scientifically irrelevant to the actual public health risk in this specific context, using a standard that favors standardization over safety efficacy. Ms. Shaw could only weakly cross-examine, arguing that a rule is a rule. But the science was irrefutable. Vance had weaponized a protocol designed for one type of meat processing, industrial bulk, against another, heritage craft, where it was demonstrably less effective at mitigating the primary risk. This was the Pathogen Paradox. The internal affairs trap. The next witness was me. I didn't talk about my grandfather or my pride. I talked about the money. I detailed the $300,000 loss from the 7 tons of inventory, the financial strain on my local farmers, and the cost of the mandated disposal. Then, Sarah introduced the final piece of evidence. The acquisition offer from Julian Reed of Cold Chain Logistics, made the day after the counterfiling. Mr. Thorne, Sarah asked, did Mr. Reed indicate why he was making a vastly overmarket value offer of $5 million for your facility, immediately following the issuance of a regulatory hold order by Agent Vance? He stated he was aware of the liquidity issues caused by the USDA action, I stated. It was clear they were attempting to acquire the plant at the exact moment I was most vulnerable due to Agent Vance's actions. Ms. Shaw sprang up. Objection. This is irrelevant conjecture and a violation of attorney-client privilege regarding potential acquisitions. Judge Davies. Objection overruled. Mr. Reed is present as a representative of Cold Chain Logistics, the parent company of which has significant market competition with the petitioner. The timing of the offer relative to the regulatory action is highly relevant to the petitioner's claim of willful misconduct. She looked pointedly at Vance. The room was completely silent. Sarah then announced, Your Honor, the petitioner moves to introduce into evidence the official internal affairs notification regarding Agent Silas Vance, filed by the petitioner, citing the precedent of Briggs v. Thorne in 1971, which addressed an FSIS agent using an obsolete rule, the half-inch rule, to unjustly bankrupt a local processing facility for commercial gain. Vance's face went ash-white. He knew the internal affairs investigation would uncover his communication with Reed and Cold Chain. The mention of the Briggs v. Thorne precedent was the final, devastating legal flourish. It proved his current action was not a mistake, but a known, punishable pattern of abuse. The verdict and the retreat. Judge Davies adjourned the court for 40 minutes. When she returned, the decision was swift, measured, and devastating to the USDA. The court finds that the Equipment Longevity and Continuous Service Exception, ELCSE, as preserved by the Congressional Grandfather Amendment of 1997, is applicable to the petitioner's equipment. The USDA's use of the 1998 protocol's RTD metric is therefore non-applicable to prairie crest meats. She continued, her voice hardening, the USDA hold order and the $25,000 administrative fine are hereby vacated and dismissed. A wave of relief washed over me, but she wasn't finished. Regarding the claim of unlawful enforcement and damages, the court accepts the evidence presented, particularly the expert testimony on the pathogen paradox and the timing of the acquisition offer, as demonstrating a prima facie case of professional misconduct and improper regulatory application for commercial advantage. Therefore, Judge Davies concluded, looking directly at Vance, the matter of damages for the unlawful destruction of inventory is immediately referred to the federal claims court. Furthermore, the internal affairs review of Agent Vance's conduct is ordered to proceed with priority. Adjourned. Vance was gone before the echo of the gavel faded, his career effectively ended by a 65-year-old grandfather clause. Julian Reed, looking furious, followed close behind. I had won the battle, secured my plant, and exposed the regulatory weapon. The fight for damages, and the future of Prairie Crest Meats, was just beginning. The cold chain contract rebuilding the chain of trust. The silence that settled over Prairie Crest Meats after the ALJ's verdict was heavier than the one following the quarantine. But this time, it was the silence of relief. The sterile conference room and the gavel blow had somehow washed the plant clean. I tore the red USDA quarantine tag off the freezer door myself, the adhesive peeling away with a sound that felt like 7 tons of debt being lifted from my soul. Frank was already on the phone with the first batch of butchers, tentatively rescheduling orders, his voice thick with cautious optimism. The victory, however, was purely legal. We had won the argument but lost the cash flow. The $300,000 worth of destroyed inventory was gone, and the cost of the specialized disposal crew, the legal fees, even with Sarah's deferred structure, and the 2 months of zero production meant my operating capital was entirely depleted. We were solvent on paper but running on fumes. Reopening wasn't just about turning the lights back on. It was about refilling a massive, empty machine with capital, livestock, and most importantly, faith. The first vindication came from the Internal Affairs Review. Within a week of Judge Davies's referral, the preliminary findings were leaked to the media. The investigation confirmed what we already knew. Agent Silas Vance had a pattern of regulatory enforcement targeting small, high-value, heritage facilities that had either refused acquisition offers or posed an inconvenient market disruption to cold chain logistics. The evidence was damning: phone records, documented coaching sessions with Julian Reed, and a clear correlation between Vance's enforcement actions and subsequent cold chain bids. Vance was immediately suspended without pay, and the Justice Department began preparing civil charges against him for abuse of official position. The closer had closed his own career. Julian Reed and Cold Chain Logistics tried to distance themselves, issuing a cold corporate statement denying all knowledge of Vance's independent actions and expressing regret over the misunderstanding. But the damage was done. The Midwestern Farmers Gazette ran the full story of the Pathogen Paradox, detailing how the 1998 protocol was misapplied, and the public uproar was fierce. Consumers began demanding clearer labeling, differentiating between industrial and heritage processes. MegaMeat, realizing they could no longer use the weapon of regulation, resorted to raw market power. Within days, my attempts to secure new high-grade heritage livestock were blocked. Local feedlot brokers suddenly couldn't take my calls, or mysteriously ran out of the specific breeds I required. My usual suppliers, though supportive, were facing aggressive, above-market rate bids from anonymous buyers, almost certainly cold chain, to lock up the next 2 years of their herds. The corporation was trying to strangle my supply chain before I could even start to rebuild. I met with the farmers. We sat in a circle in the plant, the steel smelling faintly of bleach and promise. I didn't hide the financial situation. I told them, they want to starve us out. They want you to sell your herds to them now, cheaply, rather than risk having nowhere to process them later. They're attacking the chain of trust. My salvation came from the same source as my strength, the community. The farmers agreed to delay my payments for their next delivery and sell me livestock on trust, accepting future equity in Prairie Crest Meats as collateral. They were betting on me, but more so, they were betting on themselves and the principle of local control. To raise the necessary working capital, we didn't go back to the bank. We launched a massive public campaign, Rebuild the Chain of Trust. We used the detailed evidence from the ALJ hearing, the Pathogen Paradox, and the story of the ELCSE, presenting ourselves not just as a butcher shop, but as a protected historical institution fighting corporate overreach. We started a crowdfunding effort, offering future shares in a CSA, Community-Supported Agriculture, program. The public responded instantly, recognizing the fight for what it was: a defense of small American enterprise against the abuse of regulatory power. The funds flooded in, small donations from thousands of people who were tired of corporate control over their food supply. Meanwhile, the federal claims suit for damages was filed. The claim wasn't just for the $300,000 lost. It was a class action effort, joined by other small processors who had been similarly targeted by the 1998 protocol in other states. My victory had revealed the blueprint, and now we were using it to dismantle the regulatory weapon across the country. My ultimate goal became clear: to leverage the ALJ's finding and the public support to lobby Congress for an explicit legislative update to the 1998 Protocol, establishing clear, separate, and scientifically appropriate standards for heritage, small batch processing facilities, a formal regulatory protection for local food economies. It wouldn't be the ELCSE, but the Thorne Amendment, a permanent shield against the kind of weaponized bureaucracy that had almost destroyed my family's legacy. The scent of rot was gone, replaced by the clean, metallic smell of fresh possibility and a new, stronger chain of trust. The cold chain contract, the Thorne Amendment and the legacy. The administrative law judge's decision was the fuse, but the federal claims court was the explosion. The USDA, facing massive public backlash and the undeniable evidence of Agent Vance's systemic misconduct, which was now an active federal criminal investigation, opted not to fight. To avoid a protracted trial that would only further expose regulatory capture, they agreed to a massive, multi-million-dollar settlement. The settlement covered the full value of my lost inventory, 2 years of projected business interruption, and all legal fees. Crucially, the settlement included a non-monetary clause, an agreement by the FSIS to actively consult with Dr. Chen and other heritage processors on establishing scientifically valid alternative safety standards for small-volume craft facilities. Julian Reed, realizing his legal and regulatory tools were shattered, made one final, desperate move. Cold Chain Logistics put in a new, absurdly high cash offer, $10 million, hoping the sheer figure would break my resolve. The check arrived in a sealed, engraved envelope. I didn't even open it. I stapled the unopened envelope to the community bulletin board in the plant and put a sign next to it, "Not for sale." We own the supply chain now. The momentum shifted entirely to our legislative campaign. Using the evidence from the ALJ hearing, the ELCSE, the Pathogen Paradox, and the internal documents proving MegaMeat's influence, we went to Washington. We were joined by a coalition of small farmers, butchers, and food advocates from across the country. I didn't lobby with slick talking points. I presented the yellowed maintenance logs of the Briggs 500 and the scientific charts proving my old equipment was safer than the modern standard they were trying to force. My story was simple. Regulations should ensure safety, not enforce market consolidation. The result of that pressure was the Thorne Amendment, passed 2 years later as part of a bipartisan Farm Bill rider. The amendment didn't repeal the 1998 Protocol. It simply established a separate, parallel regulatory track for certified heritage livestock processors. This track focused on the crucial metrics Dr. Chen had identified: total time below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, TTB 40, and maximum attainable core temperature, MACT, rather than the irrelevant rate of temperature drop, RTD. It gave thousands of small, family-owned facilities the legal and scientific protection they needed to operate efficiently and safely, free from the threat of technical, weaponized regulations. The Briggs 500, my grandfather's machine, was not just protected. It became the centerpiece of the new standard, running proudly and legally. Prairie Crest meat stabilized, then thrived. With the settlement money, we invested in new, equally robust, but compliant, auxiliary equipment. We expanded our workforce, hiring more local butchers and establishing a training program in partnership with the state university that taught the science of heritage processing under the new Thorne Amendment standards. My relationship with the local farmers deepened into true partnership. They became not just suppliers, but shareholders in the success, their loyalty guaranteed by the shared trauma and triumph. Our community-supported agriculture, CSA, program, funded by the public campaign, exploded, tying thousands of consumers directly to the fate of our local food system. Agent Vance was eventually convicted on obstruction charges and misuse of federal authority, a quiet footnote in a much louder story of corporate accountability. Julian Reed's career stalled, the failure to acquire Prairie Crest meats becoming a famous black mark in the world of food industry mergers. I didn't return to being just a butcher. I became an accidental advocate, spending part of my time consulting with other small processors and testifying on food policy, ensuring the Thorne Amendment was enforced justly. But the best days were still spent on the plant floor, smelling the cold, clean air of the blast chiller, watching the old Briggs 500 perform its vital, perfectly legal work. The chilling curve was always smooth now, not because the machine had changed, but because the law finally recognized the truth. That tradition, quality, and good science are the foundation of real food safety, not corporate standardization. The chain of trust, once broken by a microstutter of malice, was now forged in steel and statute, stronger than ever before.